Now it's time for this week's AT&T Trivia Quiz, brought to you by AT&T, the right choice. Last year, the rapper born Stanley Kirk Burrell went all the way to number one with his very first Top 40 hit. But he did it under his stage name. Is that stage name Young MC, Father MC, or MC Hammer? The answer after this.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. We're coming to you from Hollywood. Now, bowing in at number 37, here's MC Hammer and You Can't Touch This, a new rap song that features bits of Super Freak, Rick James' big dance hit from 1981. Hit it, Hammer.
You can't touch this. You can't touch this. You can't touch this.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
And that means we're up to the brand new number one song in the USA on Casey's Top 40. And it's the first Top 40 rap hit for a former bat boy and honorary vice president of the world champion Oakland A's. He was born Stanley Kirk Burrell. And when he was a child, Stan loved baseball almost as much as he loved music and dancing. On game days, he would go to the Oakland Coliseum and stand around the parking lot as the players were arriving. He didn't have the money to buy a ticket, but often one of the players would see him standing there and hand him a free pass. One afternoon, 10-year-old Stan was in the parking lot with a lot of his friends. He had his tape deck with him, and a James Brown song came on. Stan loved to dance, so he got up on his feet and started doing imitations of the Godfather's classic routines as his friends egged him on. Well, a man Stan didn't know happened to be passing through the parking lot. He stopped short when he saw Stan dance, amazed by the energy the 10-year-old had. And when Stan was done, the man wouldn't let him sit down. Do more, he kept saying, do more. So Stan kept dancing. Finally, the man introduced himself. He was Charlie Finley, the owner of the Oakland A's, and he invited Stan and all of his friends to that day's game as his personal guests. They sat in his luxurious private box and had a great time watching the game. Well, Charlie Finley had fun, too. He really liked young Stan. He kept inviting him to games, and then finally he hired him as a bat boy. With a lot of hard work, Stan moved up fast in the organization. He became an office assistant, and then, at the tender age of 16, an honorary vice president. This week, the man born Stanley Kirk Burrell is batting 1,000 as his first Top 40 hit becomes the first rap hit to ever make it to the top of the pop chart. The brand new number one song in the USA on Casey's Top 40 is You Can't Touch This by Stanley Kirk Burrell, the man we know as MC Hammer. What would you do if you had a chance to make $6,000 a week? Well, when he was a poor, unknown teenager, MC Hammer had that chance. Coming up, we'll tell you why he just said no.
Casey's Coast to Coast. Casey's Top 40.
Now, what would you do if you had a chance to make $6,000 a week? Well, when he was a poor, unknown teenager, MC Hammer had that chance, and he just said no. Here's why. It all began about 10 years ago. Back then, Hammer was Stan Burrell, a kid from a rough neighborhood in Oakland, California, wondering what to do with his life and how to make ends meet. But many of the guys Stan knew didn't have money problems at all. They were making thousands of dollars a week dealing drugs. Stan says they offered him the chance to join them, and it was very tempting. Quote, I was a sharp businessman, and I could have joined with a top dealer calling the shots and showing him how to invest in real estate. I really thought about that. Well, while Stan was doing his thinking, word got around that he was already involved in drugs. And he says his father woke him up one morning with tears of disappointment in his eyes. His dad said simply, Son, I hear you're dealing drugs now. Stan says those words sent a shock through his body, and he quickly said, No, Dad, you know I wouldn't do that. After his father left, Stan sat up in bed thinking about the hurt he'd seen on his father's face. Stan couldn't believe that after years of clean living, he'd even thought about throwing it all away on something as worthless as drugs. Right then and there, he made a decision. He got up, went to a recruiting office, and joined the Navy. Stan had turned down thousands of dollars a week in drug money in exchange for 3 years of military discipline. But he says that's just what he needed. Those years in the Navy gave him direction and focus, and eventually Stan decided what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to rap. Today, as MC Hammer, Stan's the most successful rapper in the world with a #1 pop hit and a 5 million selling album to his credit. This week, his latest hit from that album wraps up 7 notches to number 20 on Casey's Top 40. Here's MC Hammer and Pray.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. We're counting down the biggest hits in the USA. You know, people who've been in the military often talk about the many things they learned from the experience. Now we're up to a rapper who went into the Navy and learned how to run the tightest ship in pop music. MC Hammer says his 3 years as a sailor taught him the importance of discipline, and he's used that lesson very well. You see, a career in music can be extremely demanding. The schedule of interviews, travel, rehearsals, and shows is grueling, and some performers have been known to collapse from sheer exhaustion. To keep that from happening to him or any of the singers and dancers on his tour, Hammer runs his show like a military boot camp. Each day includes a 4-mile run, 6 hours of dancing, and an hour of weightlifting. Instead of traveling by bus, Hammer uses a private jet to guarantee that everyone on the tour gets enough sleep. And after each show, Hammer's singers and dancers have to observe a mandatory curfew. No partying for them. It's straight back to the hotel and lights out in 15 minutes. Hammer says many of the people in his show are young, just 18 and 19 years old, and he feels responsible for them. One of those young dancers says she wouldn't have it any other way. Quote, "Hammer's real strict, but he does it for our own good." So even though he's no longer a Navy man, MC Hammer still runs a very tight ship. This week, that ship is on the move, sailing up 3 notches to dock at Pier 17 on Casey's Top 40. Here's MC Hammer with Pray.
I'm Shadoe Stevens, American Top 40, and here's that breakthrough story of the hottest rapper on the charts. And it begins in the mid-'80s when this rapper with a brain for business found 2 investors. They were baseball players from the Oakland A's, Mike Davis and Dwayne Murphy. They lent him $20,000 to form his own label called Bustin' Records. Now, he released a single called Ring 'Em and sold it out of the trunk of his car. Next, he assembled a posse of folks from his neighborhood and local clubs. His crew included a bodyguard, 2 DJs, and a female trio behind him that he called Oaktown's 357. He trained them in dancing like a drill instructor at a Marine boot camp. He worked them 13, 14 hours every day of the week until they moved like clockwork. And then he recorded an entire album working with a producer in a little demo studio in the basement of an apartment building. Well, when it was done, they sent that debut album called Feel the Power to DJs and radio stations across the country, and eventually it sold 60,000 copies, a tremendous amount for an independent release. Meanwhile, he planned every move of his live show. Well, one night in May in 1988, at the Oak Tree Cabaret in Oakland, he strolled in with his entire entourage, and one of the people in the club was an executive from Capitol Records named Joy Bailey. And Joy remembers, "I didn't know who he was, but I knew he was somebody. He auditioned for Capitol and floored him with his dancing and marketing strategy. He had it all planned." So the label re-released his album with a few new tracks and a new title called Let's Get It Started, and it sold more than 1.5 million copies, a very impressive debut for MC Hammer. And now he's got the biggest album of this year, #1 for 19 weeks now, Please Hammer Don't Hurt Him. And the 3rd hit from that album is at number 16 this week on AT40, Pray by MC Hammer.
Now here's the answer to our question. Last year, the rapper-born Stanley Kirk Burrell went all the way to #1 with his first Top 40 hit, You Can't Touch This. But he did it under his stage name, MC Hammer. And that's the answer to this week's AT&T Trivia Quiz.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem, counting down the biggest hits in the USA. Well, now we're up to the latest hit for a rapper who was hired as a dance coach to teach steps to the 2 teams playing at the Super Bowl. You know, football teams have coaches who deal with tackles, with kickers, with quarterbacks, with just about every aspect of the game. But this past year, two teams also hired a rapper to teach their players to dance. If you're a regular football fan, then you know that when a lot of players score a touchdown, there's nothing they like to do more than a sort of victory dance in the end zone. Ickey Woods of the Cincinnati Bengals, for instance, is famed for doing a dance called the Ickey Shuffle. But most football players just kind of do what they do, which is move around a bit, do a couple of steps, and then go back to the sidelines. So to help choreograph the players for this year's Super Bowl, the teams hired one of the hottest dancers around. They hired the man who brought us a whole new style of dance in the video for his #1 smash, You Can't Touch This. They hired MC Hammer, the rapper who now just goes by the single name Hammer. He was named official Super Bowl dance coach. And together with his posse, Hammer came up with a bunch of fancy steps for the players to do in the end zone after touchdowns. Then Hammer taught them to the players and demonstrated the steps on the field right before the game to entertain the fans in the stands. And did the players actually do Hammer's steps during the Super Bowl? Well, not really. They just kept doing what they do. But the crowds in the stands absolutely loved Hammer and his fancy footwork, and they gave him a big round of applause. This week, the rapper who dances like no other dances into Casey's Top 40 at number 37 with the fourth of our 5 debuts. Here's Hammer with Too Legit to Quit.
Too legit to quit. Casey's biggest hits.
3 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was You Can't Touch This by a high-energy performer who once tried to combine rap and religion in the very first gospel rap act. Stanley Kirk Burrell grew up in Oakland, California in a deeply religious family. And though Stanley pursued interests like baseball and a career in the military, he always returned to gospel. In 1987, Stanley formed a duo called the Holy Ghost Boys to combine gospel and rap. They put out a single called Ring 'Em, had it pressed themselves, and sold it from the back of Stanley's car outside of churches. And that was the beginning of a career that led to one of the biggest hits in the USA 3 years ago this week. Here's Stanley Kirk Burrell, the rapper known as Hammer, and You Can't Touch This.
Break it down. Stop. Hammer time.
Casey's Top 40.
Sitting in for Casey Kasem, I'm David Perry. Now we're up to the recent top 10 hit for a group that doesn't drink, smoke, or use drugs, but they do have one major obsession. Like a lot of acts these days, the 4-man vocal group called Jodeci is trying hard to project a positive role model for their fans. They've done a lot to speak out against gang violence and drugs, showing up at schools around their hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, to talk to students who might be walking on the edge. They've made a big point at their shows of letting their fans know that they got where they are by living a life that doesn't include drinking alcohol or even smoking. But they do say they have one thing they can't live without, and they blame the rapper and dancer Hammer for getting them hooked on this addictive substance, the substance called orange juice. Their addiction began a couple of years ago when Jodeci was touring as the opening act for Hammer. On that tour, they did a lot of outdoor shows during the summer, and afterwards they'd be positively drained because of the heat and humidity. It was Hammer who told them his secret was drinking lots of orange juice, which not only replenished the liquids he'd lose on stage, but also gave him a big boost of energy and plenty of healthy vitamin C as well. Well, Jodeci tried Hammer's cure-all, and they found he was right. And since then, the drink you'll always find backstage at a Jodeci concert is orange juice, which they drink in impressive quantities, fresh squeezed, bottled, or canned. This week, the well-juiced act called Jodeci has survey song number 24 on Casey's Top 40.
American Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. In 1990, MC Hammer scored with the biggest selling rap album of all time. 6 years later, he was bankrupt. Now he's back, and he's been touched by the Lord. It's been a wild ride for the man who was born Stanley Kirk Burrell in Oakland, California. Back in 1990, he was on top of the world, selling more than 10 million copies of his album Please Hammer, Don't Hurt 'Em, and hitting with songs like You Can't Touch This, Have You Seen Her, and Pray. He was bringing home $10 million a year. His next album, Too Legit to Quit, sold 3 million copies. The album after, The Funky Headhunter, sold 1 million, and his sales continued to drop. But his spending didn't. And in 1996, Hammer filed for bankruptcy. He lost everything. The record company he'd started, the racehorses he'd bought, the huge mansion with its own bowling alley he was building in Northern California. But he didn't lose his faith. You see, before Hammer was a rapper, he sang gospel. And now he's returned to gospel to get his career back on track. He just put out a gospel album titled Family Affair. Hammer says, quote, "The switch to gospel music is a reflection of my switch to a life in Christ. Now there's a focus in my music, helping people find salvation. I deal with issues like domestic abuse and being trapped in drugs. I feel as if I've come home." And that's our update on former rapper turned gospel singer MC Hammer. Now on with the survey.
Casey's Coast to Coast.